Hello friends. About 99% of friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be very happy if you did. Also, don't forget to press the like button and leave your comments. Your interaction makes the content reach everyone and helps the channel grow. Also, let me know in the comments from which country you are watching the video. I still remember the exact time the phone rang because it was 3:17 in the morning and I had been asleep for less than an hour. I was a special agent with the FBI at the time, and I had already spent 11 years working violent crime cases across the country. I had seen crime scenes that most people would struggle to believe were real. I had interviewed people who had committed terrible things, and I had stood in rooms where the silence felt heavier than anything anyone could say. But there was one case that followed me after I left the bureau. It involved a missing police officer in a small town in Montana and an apartment building that officially did not exist. The first call came from Sergeant Daniel Reeves of the Montana Highway Patrol. His voice was controlled, but I could hear something underneath it: fear. He told me one of his troopers had gone missing while investigating a noise complaint at an old apartment complex outside Helena. At first, I assumed it was a barricaded suspect or an officer who had lost radio contact in a dead zone. Then Reeves said something that made me sit upright in bed. The trooper called dispatch after he entered the building, he said. He said there was someone inside who looked exactly like him. I asked him to repeat that. He did. Trooper Nathan Bell had responded to a complaint from a tenant who claimed someone had been knocking on her apartment door every night at exactly 3 a.m. The building was called Pine Ridge Apartments. It was an old 4-story property that had been partially condemned after a fire years earlier. Only 12 units were officially occupied. Bell arrived at 2:46 a.m. and entered through the main lobby. His body camera showed him walking through the first floor and speaking with the tenant. She was an elderly woman named Margaret Ellis who lived in Unit 9. She told Bell that someone had been knocking on her door every night for 6 nights. When she looked through the peephole, there was nobody there. Bell asked whether she had noticed anything else. She told him the footsteps always came from the 4th floor. The problem was that Pine Ridge had no 4th floor. The building had only 3 floors. Bell laughed when she first said it. Then he asked why she believed there was another floor. Margaret pointed toward the ceiling and said she could hear someone walking above her apartment. Bell's body camera captured the moment he looked upward. He then asked dispatch whether the building records showed a 4th floor. Dispatch confirmed there was no 4th floor. Bell told Margaret he would check the property and make sure nobody was inside. He walked upstairs. His camera showed the 2nd floor, then the 3rd. At 3:02 a.m., he stopped outside an apartment marked Unit 14. The building directory in the lobby did not list Unit 14. The floor plans did not contain Unit 14. Yet there it was. A dark wooden door at the end of the 3rd floor hallway, with a brass number 14 attached to it. Bell touched the radio on his shoulder and said, "Dispatch, I have an unlisted unit up here." Dispatch asked him to clarify. Bell stepped closer to the door. Then he said something I listened to more than 50 times during the investigation. "There's someone breathing behind it." The recording became quiet for several seconds. Then Bell knocked. 3 times, a man's voice answered from inside. "Come in, Nathan." Bell immediately stepped backward. He had not identified himself. Dispatch asked what was happening. Bell whispered, "He knows my name." The door opened slowly. The body camera showed a dark apartment with no furniture and no lights except a small lamp sitting on the floor. Bell entered. The camera moved through the room for approximately 20 seconds. Then he stopped. Someone was standing at the far end of the apartment. The person was wearing a Montana Highway Patrol uniform. Bell raised his weapon. "Hands where I can see them." The figure didn't move. Bell took another step. Then the figure slowly turned around. The camera caught the face for less than a second before Bell dropped his flashlight. It was his face. The recording ended immediately afterward. That was the call I received at 3:17 a.m. I arrived in Montana the following afternoon with my partner, Agent Marcus Hale. By the time we reached Pine Ridge Apartments, the local police department had already evacuated the building. Sergeant Reeves met us outside. He looked exhausted. I asked him whether they had found Trooper Bell. He shook his head. "No." "Any sign of the second person?" He looked toward the building. "That's the problem." I asked what he meant. "Reeves told me officers had searched every unit. There were 11 occupied apartments and 3 empty ones. There was no Unit 14. They had checked the roof. No 4th floor. They checked the basement. Nothing. They even brought in a structural engineer who confirmed that the building physically could not contain another floor above the 3rd. I asked where Bell's patrol car was. Reeves pointed toward the parking lot. It was still there. The driver's door was unlocked. Bell's rifle was secured inside. His phone was on the passenger seat. The engine was still warm when officers found it. The strangest thing was the building's security footage. Bell entered the lobby at 2:46 a.m. He walked upstairs. 7 minutes later, he appeared on the 3rd floor camera. Then he disappeared around the corner. 3 minutes later, the same camera showed Bell walking back toward the stairs. Except the timestamp said 2:31 a.m. He was apparently leaving the 3rd floor 15 minutes before he had entered it. We watched the footage several times. There was no obvious editing. The camera recorded continuously. I asked the building manager whether anyone had ever mentioned Unit 14. He immediately said no. Then he went pale. "Actually," he said, "there was one tenant." I asked him who. He gave us a name, Margaret Ellis, the same woman who had called the police. We went to her apartment. She was sitting in a chair beside the window with the curtains closed. She looked at me and said, "You came because Nathan didn't come back." I asked how she knew his name. She didn't answer. I showed her a photograph of Trooper Bell. She stared at it for several seconds. Then she said something that made my partner and me exchange a look. "That's not Nathan." I asked what she meant. "That's the one who went upstairs." She pointed toward the ceiling. "The real Nathan is still up there." I asked her to explain. She told us she had lived in Pine Ridge for 23 years. According to her, the building had always had 4 floors. She described the 4th floor in detail. She said it contained 6 apartments. Units 13 through 18, she claimed residents used to live there until a fire destroyed the upper level in 1999. When I checked county records, there had been a fire at Pine Ridge in 1999, but the report stated the fire was contained to the basement. No deaths, no injuries. No 4th floor. Margaret insisted the official report was wrong. Then she lowered her voice and said, "They removed it." I asked who they were. She looked toward the hallway. "The people who come when someone knocks." I asked what she meant. She told me that every few years someone in the building would hear knocking at exactly 3 a.m. If they opened their door, the person standing outside would look exactly like someone they knew. Sometimes it was a husband, sometimes a child, sometimes a police officer. She said the people who opened the door always disappeared. I asked how many. She looked at me and quietly said, "Everyone who ever answered." Before leaving, I asked Margaret one final question. "Why didn't you open your door?" She smiled sadly. "Because the first time I did, I saw myself standing outside." That night, my partner and I stayed in a motel 12 miles from Pine Ridge. At 2:58 a.m., I was sitting on the edge of the bed reviewing Bell's body camera footage when someone knocked on our motel door. 3 slow knocks. My partner looked up from his laptop. Neither of us spoke. The knock came again, 3 times. Then a man's voice came from the hallway. "Agent Cole?" I recognized it immediately. It was Sergeant Reeves. I reached for my weapon and checked the peephole. Reeves was standing outside. He looked normal, uniform, badge, hands visible. I opened the door only a few inches. "Sergeant?" He looked confused. "I need to talk to you." I asked him why he was at the motel. He said he had just received information about Bell and needed us back at Pine Ridge immediately. Something about his behavior bothered me. I asked him a question only Reeves should have known. "What did Bell say after he entered Unit 14? Reeves stared at me. Then he smiled. Not a normal smile. It was slow and deliberate. He said there was someone inside. I closed the door. Reeves remained in the hallway. A few seconds later, he knocked again. "Agent Cole." His voice changed. It sounded exactly like mine. "You should let me in." We didn't sleep that night. At 6:30 a.m., we returned to Pine Ridge with 12 officers. The building was searched again from top to bottom. Nothing. No Unit 14, no 4th floor. No evidence that Bell had ever been inside the building. Then one of the officers found something behind a false wall in the 3rd floor hallway. A narrow staircase descended into darkness. The building plans showed nothing behind that wall. Then one of them stepped forward. He placed his palm against the glass. I recognized him immediately. It was the older Ethan from the archive. He looked directly at me and mouthed something. I couldn't hear him. Thomas slowly turned off the lights. The room beyond the glass became completely dark. Then hundreds of small lights appeared, one in front of each person. They were all holding flashlights. Thomas whispered, "They're waiting for you to choose which one gets out." I asked what would happen if I refused. He looked at me. "Then the house chooses for you." The lights behind the glass suddenly turned toward me. Every single beam hit the window at once. Claire screamed. Thomas grabbed the folder and shoved it into my hands. "Run," I asked where. He pointed toward a second door behind the desk. "Anywhere that isn't here." We ran. The corridor seemed different now. Doors were opening as we passed. People were calling my name. I heard my wife. I heard my mother. I heard Daniel. I heard myself. I kept running until I saw daylight ahead. I pushed through the exit and found myself standing outside the farmhouse. Claire was beside me. Thomas was gone. The farmhouse was gone too. There was only an empty field. Claire looked at me and started crying. "Did we make it out?" I looked around. "I don't know." Then my phone rang. It was 3:17 a.m. The caller ID displayed my own name. I didn't answer. The phone stopped ringing. A voicemail appeared. I played it. My own voice said, "Ethan, if you're hearing this, then you made the wrong choice." The message ended. Then another voicemail appeared automatically. This one was from Claire. Her voice was shaking. "Don't trust me." I looked at her. She looked terrified. I didn't record that. I said nothing. She took one step backward. "Ethan!" Her expression changed. The fear disappeared from her face. A small smile appeared. "You really should have stayed inside." I raised my weapon. She didn't move. Then the world around us flickered like a television losing signal. For half a second I saw the farmhouse again. Then the field. Then the farmhouse. Then the field. Each time it changed faster. Claire's face changed too. Older, younger, different. Then it stopped. We were standing inside the farmhouse. I looked down at my hands. I was wearing my old FBI uniform. Claire was gone. Someone was knocking upstairs. 3 slow knocks. I looked toward the ceiling. Then a voice called down the staircase. "Ethan, it was my voice. Are you ready to try again?" I didn't answer. I didn't move. I simply stood there listening to the footsteps coming down the stairs. One step, then another, then another. And when the person finally appeared at the bottom of the staircase, I realized why I had never been able to remember the first investigation. I had never been the agent investigating the farmhouse. I had been the person they were looking for, and the man standing in front of me was the first Ethan Cole. He looked at me and smiled. "You finally made it back." For a long time, I convinced myself that the voicemail was some kind of elaborate prank. I changed my number. I moved apartments. I stopped talking about the case completely. I even stopped telling people that I had ever worked in Idaho. I wanted the whole thing out of my life. And for almost 2 years it worked. Then one morning I received a letter from a woman named Claire Dawson. She lived in a small town outside Boise and claimed she had found my name in an old police report. She didn't say which report. She simply wrote that she had something that belonged to me and that she was afraid to mail it. She asked me to meet her at a diner on the outskirts of town. I almost threw the letter away. Then I noticed the date written at the bottom. It was the exact same date as the photograph in my garage. I went. Claire was sitting in the back corner of the diner when I arrived. She looked to be in her late 50s. She kept checking the windows as if she expected someone to be watching her from outside. When I sat down, she didn't introduce herself. She simply placed a small plastic evidence bag on the table. Inside was a badge. My old FBI badge. The one I had supposedly surrendered when I retired. I stared at it for several seconds. "Where did you get this?" I asked. Claire looked at me. "Your friend gave it to me." I immediately thought of Daniel. "You know Daniel?" She shook her head. "Not personally." She lowered her voice. "The man who calls himself Daniel." I felt my stomach tighten. "What do you mean?" She leaned closer. "There have been people disappearing around that farmhouse for decades. Police officers, federal agents, search volunteers, even ordinary people who were just driving through the area. Every few years somebody comes back. They look normal. They have the memories. They have the documents. They have everything. But their families say something is wrong. I asked what was wrong with them. She looked toward the window. They don't remember the same childhood. I didn't say anything. Claire continued. My brother disappeared there in 2003. 3 years later, he came home. She paused. He looked exactly the same. He knew my name. He knew our parents. He knew where we grew up. He remembered our dog. He remembered everything. So what was wrong? I asked. Claire's eyes filled with tears. He remembered things that never happened. She told me her brother started describing rooms inside their childhood home that had never existed. He talked about people their family had never met. He claimed their father had taken him to a basement every Sunday when he was a child. There was no basement. Their father had died before Claire was born. Then one night her brother woke her at 3:17 a.m. and told her he had to go back because someone was waiting for him. She never saw him again. What does this have to do with me? I asked. Claire pushed the evidence bag toward me. He told me that if an FBI agent named Ethan Cole ever came looking for him, I should give this to you. I looked at the badge again. When did he tell you that? Claire whispered. 20 years ago. I left the diner without saying goodbye. I drove for nearly an hour before pulling into a gas station. I needed to think. I opened the evidence bag and examined the badge under the fluorescent lights. It was definitely mine. Same number, same engraving, same scratches along the edge. Then I noticed something engraved on the back that I had never seen before. Property of continuity division. I searched the term on my phone. Nothing. I searched old FBI records. Nothing. I called a former colleague who had worked in administrative records. He told me there was no continuity division. I asked whether he'd ever heard of Black Ridge or mile marker 19. There was a long silence. Then he said, Ethan, where did you hear those names? I told him about the investigation. He said, you need to stop talking about this. I asked why. He hung up. That night I went back through every file I still had from my career. I found nothing. No photographs, no reports, no travel records, nothing connected to Idaho. It was as though those years had been erased. Then I found a folder hidden behind the bottom drawer of my desk. I had never seen it before. Inside were handwritten notes. Some were mine, some were not. The first page said Attempt 1. The second said Attempt 2. The third said Attempt 3. There were 8 pages. 8 attempts. 8 investigations. 8 versions of the same case. The final page was labeled Attempt 8. Underneath was a list of names. Ryan Mercer, Daniel Price, Ethan Cole, Claire Dawson, then another name I didn't recognize, Thomas Bell. At the bottom, someone had written, Thomas is the only one who remembers everything. Find him before the next cycle. I searched the name immediately. Thomas Bell had been a county detective in Idaho. He had disappeared in 1997 while investigating an abandoned farmhouse near mile marker 19. There was one photograph attached to his file. I opened it. He looked older than the man I remembered from the archive. Gray hair, deep wrinkles, tired eyes. But there was something familiar about him. He was standing beside the farmhouse. In the background was a 4th-floor window. Someone was looking out from it. I zoomed in. The person in the window was me. I called Claire. She answered on the first ring. You found him, she said. I asked how she knew. Because he's standing behind me. I heard a man's voice in the background. Claire, she screamed. The phone dropped. I heard footsteps. Then the line went dead. I drove straight to her house. The front door was open. The television was still running. Her purse was on the kitchen counter. Her car was in the driveway. But Claire was gone. On the dining table was a sheet of paper. 3 words were written across it. He remembers now. I looked through the windows. Nobody was outside. Then I heard the sound of a car starting. Claire's car pulled away from the driveway. I ran outside and watched it disappear down the road. I called the police. They arrived 20 minutes later and searched the neighborhood. They found nothing. When I told them about the farmhouse, they looked at me like I was confused. One officer finally said something that made my blood run cold. Sir, there hasn't been a farmhouse at mile marker 19 for 27 years. I asked what used to be there. He said, nothing. I drove there anyway. I knew what I would find before I reached the road. The farmhouse was there, exactly as I remembered it. Same broken porch, same dead trees, Same windows. But this time there was something new. A car was parked outside. Claire's car. I approached slowly. The driver's door was open. Her purse was on the seat. Her phone was on the dashboard. The screen displayed one missed call. The number was mine. I hadn't called her. I stood there staring at the screen when the farmhouse front door opened. Nobody was visible inside. Then I heard a voice. Ethan. It was Daniel. I raised my weapon. "Where are you?" He answered from inside. "Upstairs." I stepped onto the porch. "What happened to Claire?" Silence. Then he said, "She remembered too much." I opened the door. The living room looked exactly as it had years earlier. Dust, broken furniture, the old television. But there was one difference. The staircase had been removed. In its place was a doorway. Above it was a brass number. 19, I entered. Behind the door was the same hidden corridor. This time I didn't hesitate. I walked inside alone. The door closed behind me. I heard the lock click. The corridor was darker than I remembered. There were no lights, only small red bulbs along the floor. Every few feet I passed another door. Some were open. Behind one I saw a police station. Behind another I saw a bedroom. Behind another I saw a hospital room. Each room looked real. Each room contained people who were frozen in place like photographs. Then I reached a door with my name on it. I opened it. Inside was my old FBI office. My desk, my chair, my computer. Even the coffee mug I had used every morning for years. Someone was sitting behind my desk. It was Thomas Bell. He looked exactly like the photograph. He was holding a folder. "You took your time," he said. I asked where Claire was. He pointed toward the chair beside him. She was sitting there, alive, terrified. I moved toward her. Thomas stopped me. "Don't touch her." I asked why. "Because she's not the one you came here for." I stared at him. "Then who am I here for?" Thomas looked at me for several seconds. "Your original self." I didn't understand. He opened the folder and showed me a photograph. It was taken inside the farmhouse decades earlier. A young man was standing beside a table. He looked exactly like me. Thomas pointed to him. "That's Ethan Cole." I stared at the photograph. "That's me." Thomas shook his head. "No, that's the first one." He turned the page. Another photograph showed a slightly older version of me. Second, another. Third, another. Fourth. He continued until the 8th photograph. The 8th version looked exactly like the man I saw in the archive. Older, tired, broken. Thomas placed the final photograph on the desk. "You're number 9. I felt my hands go numb. Claire began crying. "He doesn't know yet." Thomas looked at her. "He will." I asked what happened to the original Ethan. Thomas pointed toward the wall behind me. There was a large observation window I hadn't noticed before. Beyond it was a room filled with people, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Every one of them looked like me. Some were young, some were old, some were wearing FBI uniforms, others wore civilian clothes. They were all standing silently behind the glass, watching us. The people who enter believe they're solving a disappearance. They don't realize they're the missing people. Price asked, "Where is the real Mercer?" Mercer looked at him. "He's still inside." "Inside where?" "Where you've been." Price stepped forward. "And who are you?" Mercer looked at me. "I'm the one who came back." I asked what happened to the others. He pointed toward the ceiling. "Some are still there. Some came back and don't know they're different. Some came back knowing exactly what happened." I asked him which one I was. He smiled. "You're the one who remembers." Then he pulled something from his pocket and tossed it onto the table. It was my FBI credentials. I stared at them. "Those were in my jacket." He shook his head. "No, those were in your file." Price looked at me. "Ethan, don't touch them." I ignored him. I picked up the credentials. The photograph on my FBI identification card wasn't me. It was the older version of me from the hidden hallway. The badge number was different too. I turned the card over. Written across the back were 2 words, "Replacement 3. I dropped it. Mercer walked toward the front door. "You need to decide." I asked what decision. He opened the door and looked back at us. "You can leave and forget everything." He paused. "Or you can go back inside and find out who you really are." Price stepped toward him. "We're not going anywhere." Mercer looked at him for several seconds. "You already said that last time." Then he walked outside. We followed him onto the porch. The moment my foot touched the ground, everything changed. The farmhouse disappeared. There was no road, no patrol cars, no trees. We were standing in a huge concrete room surrounded by filing cabinets. Hundreds of them, thousands. The air smelled exactly like the hidden corridor. Price slowly turned in a circle. We're back. I looked at the nearest cabinet. A label was attached to it. Mercer, Ryan. Another Reed Price, Daniel. I found mine. Cole, Ethan. The cabinet was open. Inside were dozens of photographs. I picked up the first one. It showed me as a child. The second showed me graduating high school. The third showed me entering the FBI. The fourth showed me standing beside Price. Then I reached the final photograph. It showed the farmhouse. I was standing outside it. Price was beside me. Mercer stood behind us. All three of us were looking toward the camera. The date printed on the bottom was 20 years earlier. I stared at Price. We've done this before. He nodded slowly. More than once. I asked him how many times. He looked toward the endless rows of cabinets. I don't know. Then we heard a drawer opening somewhere behind us. We turned. A man was standing between the cabinets. He wore an FBI suit and carried a file in his hand. He looked exactly like me, older, gray hair. Same eyes, same scar on my chin. He walked toward us slowly. You finally remembered, he said. I raised my weapon. Who are you? He looked almost disappointed. I'm you, Price whispered. Don't listen. The older man ignored him. You have been inside the house 7 times. I shook my head. That's impossible. He opened the file. Inside were photographs of every previous investigation. Different years, different partners, different versions of me, but the same farmhouse appeared in every photograph. Every time you enter, you think you're investigating someone else, he said. Every time you leave, you believe you've escaped. He pointed toward Price. He doesn't remember because he always chooses to forget. Price looked at me. That's not true. The older version of me smiled. Ask him where he was before this case. Price went silent. I asked him, Daniel? He wouldn't answer. The older man stepped closer. Ask him why he has no photographs of his childhood. Price's face changed. I looked at him. Daniel? He finally whispered, because I don't have one. I stared at him. He had never told me that. The older man closed the file. That's because Daniel Price was never born. Price immediately raised his weapon and fired. The shot echoed through the archive. The older man fell backward. For a moment there was silence. Then Price looked at me. His hands were shaking. We have to go. I looked at the body on the floor. Blood was spreading beneath him. I looked back at Price. Who are you? He didn't answer. Instead, he pointed toward the far end of the archive. A door had appeared there. Above it was a small digital clock. The numbers changed slowly. 2:16 a.m. Price whispered, We have 1 minute. I asked, until what? He looked at me with tears in his eyes. Until the house starts again, the clock changed. 3:17 a.m. Every cabinet in the archive opened at once. Thousands of files spilled onto the floor. From somewhere deep in the building came the sound of hundreds of people knocking on doors. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks. Then 3 more. Price grabbed my arm. Run! We sprinted toward the door. Behind us, voices began calling our names. Some sounded like people we knew. Some sounded like us. I heard my mother's voice. Price heard his father's. We didn't stop. We reached the door and pushed through it. On the other side was a quiet residential street in Denver. My street, my house was directly ahead. The porch light was on. My wife was standing at the front door. She looked exactly as I remembered her. She smiled when she saw me. I took 1 step toward her. Price grabbed me. Don't, I looked at him. That's my wife, he shook his head. No, that's what it wants you to believe. My wife called my name. Ethan, come home. I felt tears forming in my eyes. I wanted to go to her. More than anything, I'd wanted to go home for the entire investigation. Then she smiled again. Something was wrong with the smile. It was the same slow smile I'd seen on the people inside the farmhouse. I stepped backward. The house lights turned off one by one. My wife remained standing in the darkness. Then another figure stepped beside her. It was me, the older version. He placed a hand on her shoulder and looked directly at me. You should have stayed inside. The street disappeared. I woke up in a hospital 3 days later. The doctors told me I'd been found unconscious beside a highway in Idaho. There was no farmhouse. No missing deputy. No Daniel Price. When I asked about my partner, they told me I had arrived in Idaho alone. They searched the Bureau database and found no agent named Daniel Price had ever worked with me. I thought they were lying until they showed me my personnel file. I'd been assigned to that case alone. There was no record of Price anywhere. I left the FBI 6 months later. I tried to convince myself that the entire experience had been caused by exhaustion and trauma. For years it worked. Then one night I found an old photograph inside a box in my garage. It showed me standing outside the farmhouse. I was younger. Price was beside me. Mercer stood behind us. On the back, someone had written Attempt 8. I turned the photograph over again because I thought I had imagined it. But the words were still there. Then my phone rang. The screen showed no number. I answered without thinking. For several seconds there was only breathing. Then I heard my own voice whisper, "Ethan, it's Daniel." I froze. The voice continued. "I finally found the way out." I asked where he was. He whispered, "I'm standing outside your house." I looked toward the window. Someone was standing beneath the streetlight across from my home. I couldn't see his face. Then he raised one hand and waved. My phone crackled. Daniel whispered, "Whatever you do, don't let him see you looking at him." I slowly stepped away from the window. The figure across the street lowered his hand. Then he began walking toward my house. I never found out who was standing there that night because I left through the back door and drove until sunrise. I haven't returned to that house since. But there is one detail I have never been able to explain. The photograph I found in my garage was dated 20 years before the case ever happened. And in the photograph, Daniel Price was standing beside me. The FBI says he never existed. I know that's not true, because every year on the same night I receive a phone call at exactly 3:17 a.m. I never answer it anymore. But last year I made the mistake of listening to the voicemail. There was only one sentence. My own voice said, "Ethan, we're still inside." They were motionless. I called out to them. Nobody answered. We approached cautiously. Every officer had his back toward us. Then one slowly turned around. His face was wrong, not distorted, not injured. It was simply unfamiliar. He looked at me and said, "You're late." Another officer turned. Same face, then another. Every member of the tactical team had the same face. None of them were people we'd brought inside. They all smiled at us. Price grabbed my arm. "Run!" We turned and sprinted toward the farmhouse. Behind us, dozens of footsteps began following. We reached the doorway and burst outside into daylight. My partner was still beside me. The farmhouse stood exactly as it had before. The patrol cars were still parked outside. The trees were still. Everything looked normal. Then I noticed something across the road. Mile marker 19 was gone. There was only a blank stretch of asphalt. We drove away without stopping. 3 hours later, we reached the sheriff's office. Nobody recognized us. The desk sergeant asked who we were. I showed him my credentials. He stared at them for several seconds before saying, "These are valid." Then he asked why 2 FBI agents were investigating a missing deputy who had been found safely that morning. I froze. "What?" He pulled up the dispatch report. Deputy Ryan Mercer had returned to the station at 7:04 a.m. He was alive. He was unharmed. He claimed he had never been near mile marker 19. I asked where Price was. The desk sergeant looked confused. "Who's Price?" I turned around. My partner was standing beside me. At least I thought he was. He looked at me and smiled. Then he quietly said, "You already know." The next thing I remember is waking up alone in a motel room 3 states away. I don't know how I got there. My FBI credentials were gone. My phone contained no photographs from the investigation. The case didn't exist in the Bureau database. I eventually left the FBI 2 years later. I never told anyone the complete story. But something happened last month that convinced me the farmhouse wasn't finished with me. I received an envelope without a return address. Inside was a photograph. It showed the farmhouse at mile marker 19. Standing on the porch were 3 people. Deputy Ryan Mercer, Daniel Price, and me. All 3 of us were looking toward the camera. The photograph was dated yesterday. On the back, someone had written one sentence. The next investigation begins at 3:17 a.m. I don't know who sent it. I don't know whether Price is still alive. And I don't know if the man I left Montana with was actually my partner. But I do know one thing. There is no mile marker 19 on that road anymore. I've checked. Twice. And yet every few weeks I wake up at exactly 3:17 in the morning because I hear someone knocking on my front door. 3 slow knocks. I never answer. I don't even look through the peephole anymore. Because the last time I did, I saw myself standing outside. We reached the hidden corridor and found the tactical team standing at the entrance. Nobody moved. They were lined up shoulder to shoulder with their backs toward us. I immediately raised my weapon and told Price to stay behind me. "Something's wrong," I whispered. Price didn't answer. I looked at him and realized he was staring at the officers with an expression I couldn't read. "Daniel." He slowly shook his head. "Those aren't our people." I looked again. He was right. I recognized the uniforms but not the faces. None of them had been part of the team we brought into the farmhouse. The nearest officer slowly turned around. He was wearing a state police uniform, but his face was completely unfamiliar. "Agent Cole," he said calmly. "You're expected downstairs." I asked who he was. He smiled. "You know who I am." Another officer turned around. Then another. Every face was different, but every one of them had the same expression. Calm, patient, almost bored. Price grabbed my arm. "Back up!" We started moving toward the office. The officers didn't follow. They simply watched us. Then one of them spoke. "You can't leave through the front door." Price stopped. "Why?" The officer pointed toward the farmhouse. "Because that's where you came from." I looked behind us. The office door was gone. So was the hallway. We were standing in the same hidden corridor again. The wooden walls stretched endlessly in both directions. The tactical team was gone. Price looked at me. "We need to find another exit." We chose the left corridor and began walking. Every 30 or 40 feet there was another door. Some were open, some were locked, others had names written across them. I started recognizing names from missing persons cases, people who had vanished without explanation over the last 20 years. One door had the name Ryan Mercer written across it. Another had Daniel Price. Then I saw a third door. My name was on it. I stopped. Price walked past me before realizing I wasn't following. "Ethan?" I pointed at the door. "That's mine." He stared at it for several seconds. Then he said something that made me feel sick. There wasn't supposed to be a third one. I asked what he meant. He didn't answer. He reached for the handle. I grabbed his wrist. "Don't." He looked at me. "We need to know what's inside." "No, we need to get out." He slowly pulled his hand away. Then the door opened by itself. There was no room behind it. There was a staircase leading upward. We could see daylight at the top, real daylight. I could even feel cold air coming down the steps. We climbed quickly. When we reached the top, we stepped through another door and found ourselves standing in the farmhouse living room. Everything looked exactly as it had when we first arrived. Dust covered the furniture. The broken television sat against the wall. The old sofa was still there. Mercer's patrol car was visible through the window. For a moment I thought we had escaped. Then Price looked outside and froze. "Ethan," I followed his gaze. There were 2 patrol cars parked beside Mercer's vehicle. An ambulance was behind them. Several officers were standing near the driveway. One of them was Sergeant Reeves. Another was Deputy Ryan Mercer. He looked completely normal. He was talking to the other officers as if nothing had happened. Price whispered, "That's impossible." I didn't answer. Then the front door opened. Sergeant Reeves walked inside. "Agent Cole?" I raised my weapon. Reeves stopped immediately. "Easy," I asked where we were. He looked confused. "The farmhouse." I asked him what day it was. He gave me the date. It was the same day we had arrived. Only 3 hours had passed. I looked at Price. His face had gone pale. "How long were we inside?" he asked. Reeves frowned. "Inside where?" Price looked at me. I realized then that Reeves couldn't see the hidden corridor. He couldn't see the strange things we'd encountered. To him, we had simply been standing inside the farmhouse for a few minutes. I asked where Deputy Mercer had been. Reeves pointed toward the porch. "He's right outside." I walked toward the door. Mercer turned when he saw me. He looked exactly like the man from the photographs. I asked him where he'd been since leaving his cruiser. He said he'd been at the sheriff's office all morning. I asked him whether he had ever heard of Pine Ridge Apartments. He stared at me. "No." I asked about Unit 14. He laughed nervously. "Agent, I don't know what you're talking about." Price stepped beside me. "Ryan, look at me." Mercer did. Price asked, "Do you know who I am?" Mercer looked confused. "You're Agent Price." Price nodded. "We've met before." Mercer shook his head. "No." Price looked at me. Something had changed in his expression. "That's not him," he whispered. I asked why. Price pointed at Mercer's left hand. He was wearing a wedding ring. In every photograph we'd seen, Mercer had worn his ring on his right hand. It was a tiny detail, but one I had noticed during the investigation. Mercer looked down at his hand. Then he smiled. "People make mistakes." I felt my stomach tighten. "Where did you get that ring?" He didn't answer. Instead, he looked directly at me and said, "You should go home, Agent Cole." I asked him why. He leaned closer. "Because your wife is waiting for you." I hadn't told anyone in Montana that I was married. I hadn't even mentioned my wife's name. Price immediately stepped between us. "Back away," Mercer smiled again. "You're already too late." Then the lights inside the farmhouse went out. When they came back on, Sergeant Reeves and the other officers were gone. Only Mercer remained. He was standing in the middle of the living room. His expression had completely changed. He looked tired, almost sad. "You don't understand what this place does," he said. I kept my weapon trained on him. "Then explain it." He shook his head. "Every time someone finds the house, it creates a new version of the investigation." He assumed Mercer was inside and requested backup. By the time backup arrived, the house was empty. Mercer was gone. We reached the property shortly before sunset. I remember the first thing that bothered me was the road itself. There was no sign indicating a farmhouse, no mailbox, no driveway marker, nothing. Then the trees opened and the house appeared. It was a 2-story wooden structure with faded white siding and a collapsed porch. Several windows were broken. The roof sagged badly near the rear. It looked abandoned for decades. Yet Mercer's patrol car sat beside the driveway with the engine still warm. I approached the vehicle with a state investigator while Price documented the scene. Mercer's coffee cup was still in the holder. His notebook lay open on the passenger seat. The final entry read, "Possible structure near road." Beneath that were 3 numbers. 619. There was no explanation. We processed the cruiser for fingerprints and DNA before entering the house. The front door was unlocked. Inside, we found dust covering almost everything. The living room contained an old sofa and a broken television. The kitchen had cabinets hanging open and a refrigerator that hadn't worked in years. The staircase leading upstairs was covered in dust, except for one narrow strip in the center. Someone had been walking up and down those stairs recently. We followed the trail to the second floor. There were 4 bedrooms. 3 were empty. The 4th contained a mattress on the floor. On the mattress was a photograph of Deputy Mercer. He was standing outside the sheriff's office. The photograph appeared recent. He was wearing the exact uniform he had been wearing when he disappeared. Price picked it up with a gloved hand and examined the back. There was a date written in black ink. It was 2 days after Mercer's disappearance. We immediately contacted the county lab and photographed everything. While the team worked upstairs, I returned to the first floor and noticed something I hadn't seen earlier. The hallway contained 6 doors. The property records showed only 5 rooms on the first floor. I counted them again. 6 doors. One was at the very end of the hallway where the original blueprints showed a solid wall. There was no handle, just a small metal plate with the number 19 engraved into it. I called Price. He came downstairs and stared at the door. "That's new," he said. I asked him what he meant. He pointed toward the dust on the floor. There was a clean rectangle directly beneath the door, as if someone had recently opened it. We photographed the area before carefully examining the frame. There was no lock, no hinges, no visible way to open it. Then we heard something from the other side. A quiet knock. 3 times. Everyone in the house froze. Another 3 knocks followed. Price looked at me. I motioned for everyone to stay back. We waited. Nothing happened. Then a man's voice came through the door. "Agent Cole?" It was my voice. I felt every hair on my arms rise. Price immediately drew his weapon. The voice spoke again. "Open the door," I asked who was inside. The answer came without hesitation. "You already know." We backed away from the door and evacuated the house. For the next hour, nobody entered. We established a perimeter and brought in additional personnel. A structural engineer arrived and examined the building. He couldn't explain the 6th doorway. According to the architecture, there was supposed to be a solid exterior wall in that location. We eventually cut through the wall from the opposite side. Behind it was empty space. No room, no hallway. Just darkness extending deeper into the structure than the house physically allowed. We lowered a camera through the opening. The feed showed a narrow corridor with wooden walls. At the far end stood another door. Written across it in faded paint were the words, "Mile Marker 19." We decided not to proceed until daylight. At 7:15 the following morning, the camera feed showed something different. Someone was standing in the corridor, a man wearing a sheriff's uniform. The camera was positioned 30 feet from the figure, but the face was clear enough to identify him. It was Deputy Ryan Mercer. He looked directly into the camera and said, "Agent Cole, don't come looking for me." Then the video went black. We entered the hidden corridor at 8 a.m. with a 6-person tactical team. The hallway was much longer than the farmhouse could physically contain. Every few feet there were doors on either side. Some had names written on them, others had dates. One door carried the name of a missing person from a case I'd worked 6 years earlier in Colorado. Another carried the name of a police officer who had disappeared in Oregon. A third carried the name of a woman whose kidnapping had become one of the biggest unsolved cases in Idaho history. None of those people were connected to each other, yet their names were inside that house. We reached the final door after almost 20 minutes of walking. It opened into a large room containing dozens of filing cabinets. Each cabinet was labeled with a person's name. We found Mercer's file first. Inside were photographs of his childhood home, his school records, his police academy records, his marriage certificate, medical records, even photographs that had never been made public. The final page contained a handwritten note. Subject became aware at 6:13 a.m. I checked the timestamp. Exactly when Mercer had first called dispatch. Then I noticed something else. There was a second file beside his. My name was on it. I opened it with shaking hands. The first photograph showed me arriving at the FBI field office in 2004. The second showed me at Quantico. The third showed my wedding. The fourth showed me standing beside my partner Price. Every major event of my career was documented. The final photograph was different. It showed me standing inside the farmhouse at mile marker 19. I was looking directly at the camera. The photograph had been taken that morning. I hadn't been aware of anyone photographing me. On the back was a handwritten message. Subject does not remember the first visit. I asked Price to look at the photograph. His face changed immediately. "Ethan," he said quietly, "I've seen this before." I asked him where. He pointed toward another file cabinet. His name was written across it. We opened it together. Inside were photographs of Price at locations I knew he'd never visited. There were images of him standing outside the farmhouse, images of him walking through the hidden corridor, images of him speaking to people who had been missing for years. The final photograph showed Price standing beside Deputy Mercer. Both men were alive. Both were wearing the same clothes they had been wearing when they disappeared. Then Price looked at me and said something I'll never forget. "I think we've been here before." I asked him what he meant. He shook his head. "I don't remember the details, but I know this hallway." Before I could respond, we heard footsteps behind us. Someone was walking toward the room. Slow footsteps, heavy boots. We turned toward the corridor. Deputy Mercer appeared at the far end. He looked exactly as he had in the photograph. "Ryan," I called. He raised his hand. "Don't come closer." I asked where he'd been. He looked at Price, then he looked at me. "You're not the first team." Price stepped forward. Mercer shook his head. "And you're not the first, Ethan." The light suddenly went out. When they returned, Mercer was gone. So was Price. I was alone in the room. Every door had disappeared except one. The door directly in front of me slowly opened. Inside was a small office, a desk, a chair, a telephone. On the desk sat a case file. My name was written across it. The phone rang. I stared at it for several seconds before answering. A man on the other end whispered, "Agent Cole, this is Daniel Price." I asked where he was. He said, "I'm outside." I looked toward the office window. There was no window, only a blank wall. Price continued speaking. "Listen carefully. Whatever you do, don't believe the person who comes through that door." Someone knocked. 3 times, Price whispered. "He's here." The doorknob slowly turned. I raised my weapon. The door opened. Daniel Price stepped inside. He looked terrified. He immediately closed the door behind him. "Ethan, we have to go." I asked where the real Price was. He stared at me. "What do you mean?" I pointed toward the telephone. "You were just on the phone." His expression changed. He slowly reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. The call log showed no outgoing calls. Then the telephone rang again. Price and I both stared at it. The voice on the receiver was mine. "Don't trust him." Price whispered, "Ethan." I slowly backed away. Both of us had our weapons raised now. Then the voice on the phone said something that neither of us expected. "The house isn't finding people. It's replacing them." The line went dead. Price lowered his weapon. "We need to leave." We ran. We reached the hidden corridor and found the tactical team standing at the entrance. The staircase was old and covered in dust, but there were fresh footprints on every step. We followed them down. They ended at a concrete door with the number 14 painted in faded black letters. The door was locked from the outside. We cut the lock and entered. There was a hallway beyond it. 6 apartment doors lined both sides. Units 13 through 18, every door was closed. Every door had fresh fingerprints around the handle. We opened Unit 14 first. The apartment was empty except for a chair facing the wall. On the wall, someone had written dozens of names. Some were crossed out, some weren't. Near the bottom, I saw the name Nathan Bell. Beneath it was another name. Mine. My partner noticed it at the same time. Then we heard a knock from Unit 15, 3 slow knocks. We turned toward the door. A voice came from inside. "Marcus?" My partner froze. Nobody had called him by his first name since arriving in Montana. The voice continued. "It's Dad. Marcus's father had been dead for 11 years. He told me that later. At the time, he just stood there staring at the door. I grabbed his shoulder. "Don't answer." The knocking stopped. Then another voice came from Unit 16. It was my mother's voice. She had died when I was 19. "Ethan?" I didn't move. My partner looked at me. "You hear that?" I nodded. We backed away from the doors. Then all 6 apartment doors opened simultaneously. The hallway was empty, completely empty. But from inside every apartment we heard someone breathing. 6 different people, 6 different breathing patterns. Then a voice from Unit 14 whispered, "You're late." I looked inside. The chair was no longer facing the wall. It was facing the doorway. Someone was sitting in it. He was wearing my FBI jacket. His back was toward us. I raised my weapon. "Turn around." The man slowly turned his head. It was me, older, much older. He looked exhausted and terrified. He raised one finger to his lips. Then he whispered, "Don't let them know you found the stairs." The lights went out. When they came back on, the hallway was empty. My partner was gone. So was the older version of me. The only thing left was a piece of paper lying on the floor. I picked it up. Written across it were 4 words. "You already opened the door." We searched Pine Ridge for 6 more hours. We found no trace of Marcus. No footprints, no blood. No evidence he had ever entered the hidden hallway. When I returned to the 3rd floor that evening, the false wall was gone. There was no staircase, no door. No Unit 14. Nothing. The official investigation eventually concluded that Trooper Bell and Agent Hale had disappeared under unknown circumstances. I was transferred out of Montana 2 weeks later. I never talked publicly about what happened, not until years later. But there is one thing I never told my supervisors. 3 days after Marcus disappeared, I received a package at my apartment in Denver. There was no return address. Inside was a photograph of me standing outside Pine Ridge Apartments. I was looking directly at the camera. The photograph had clearly been taken from across the street. On the back was a handwritten date. It was dated 3 months in the future. Underneath the date, someone had written, "Unit 14 is waiting." I kept the photograph for years. I finally destroyed it after retirement. At least I thought I did. Last month, I found another copy inside an old FBI file that I had never opened before. The photograph was different this time. It showed me standing outside the same building, but I wasn't alone. Marcus was standing beside me. He looked exactly as he had the night he disappeared. Behind us was the 4th floor of Pine Ridge Apartments. 6 windows were illuminated. Someone was standing behind every window, and in the center window was a man who looked exactly like me. He was holding a piece of paper against the glass. I enlarged the photograph and read the words written on it. 3:17 a.m., don't answer the phone. That's when I realized something that still bothers me today. The photograph had been taken from inside my own apartment. I don't know who took it. I don't know how they got inside. and I don't know whether Unit 14 ever existed in the first place, but every night since I found that photograph, I keep my phone turned off before I go to sleep. Because sometimes at exactly 3:17 a.m. it still rings, and when it does, I can hear someone breathing on the other end. If you enjoyed this story and want more disturbing FBI and police horror stories told from the perspective of the people who actually investigated them, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. And if you're listening to this late at night, maybe do yourself a favor and don't answer any unknown calls tonight. Had been with the FBI for almost 14 years when I learned that sometimes the most disturbing cases are the ones that begin with a call that sounds completely ordinary. This one started with a missing person report in northern Idaho. A 38-year-old county sheriff's deputy named Ryan Mercer had failed to return home after his overnight shift. His patrol vehicle was found parked beside an abandoned farmhouse near mile marker 19 on a road that locals rarely used after dark. His radio was still inside the vehicle. His duty weapon was still secured in the holster. His phone was sitting on the dashboard with the screen cracked but still working. The strange part was that nobody had reported an abandoned farmhouse at that location. According to county property records, there was no residence at mile marker 19. There hadn't been one for almost 40 years. When my supervisor called me into his office that morning, he told me to pack for 2 days. I asked what we knew. He slid a photograph across the desk. It showed a dark farmhouse surrounded by dead grass and tall pine trees. "That's where they found the cruiser," he said. I looked at the photograph again. "Whose property is it?" He shook his head. "That's what we're trying to figure out." My partner at the time was Special Agent Daniel Price. We flew into Boise and drove north with 2 Idaho State Police investigators. The farther we got from the city, the quieter the roads became. By the time we reached the county where Mercer had disappeared, there were stretches of highway where we could drive for 10 minutes without seeing another vehicle. Sergeant Hollis met us at a small sheriff's office and gave us the preliminary report. Mercer had finished his shift at 5:42 a.m. His supervisor remembered seeing him leave the station. At 6:13 a.m., dispatch received a transmission from Mercer's patrol radio. He said he had stopped near mile marker 19 because he thought he saw someone standing beside the road. Dispatch asked whether he needed assistance. Mercer said no. Then he said, "There's a house here." Dispatch told him there was no house. Mercer replied, "I know." That was the last clear transmission. 7 minutes later, his radio transmitted again. There was no voice, just breathing. Dispatch attempted to contact him 11 times. Nobody answered. At 6:31 a.m., another deputy was sent to locate him. He found Mercer's cruiser parked beside an old dirt road. The driver's door was open. The engine was running. The farmhouse stood about 80 yards away. The deputy approached the property but stopped at the edge of the driveway because he heard someone calling his name from inside the house. Then one of them stepped forward. He placed his palm against the glass. I recognized him immediately. It was the older Ethan from the archive. He looked directly at me and mouthed something. I couldn't hear him. Thomas slowly turned off the lights. The room beyond the glass became completely dark. Then hundreds of small lights appeared, one in front of each person. They were all holding flashlights. Thomas whispered, "They're waiting for you to choose which one gets out." I asked what would happen if I refused. He looked at me. "Then the house chooses for you." The lights behind the glass suddenly turned toward me. Every single beam hit the window at once. Claire screamed. Thomas grabbed the folder and shoved it into my hands. "Run," I asked where. He pointed toward a second door behind the desk. "Anywhere that isn't here." We ran. The corridor seemed different now. Doors were opening as we passed. People were calling my name. I heard my wife. I heard my mother. I heard Daniel. I heard myself. I kept running until I saw daylight ahead. I pushed through the exit and found myself standing outside the farmhouse. Claire was beside me. Thomas was gone. The farmhouse was gone too. There was only an empty field. Claire looked at me and started crying. "Did we make it out?" I looked around. "I don't know." Then my phone rang. It was 3:17 a.m. The caller ID displayed my own name. I didn't answer. The phone stopped ringing. A voicemail appeared. I played it. My own voice said, "Ethan, if you're hearing this, then you made the wrong choice." The message ended. Then another voicemail appeared automatically. This one was from Claire. Her voice was shaking. "Don't trust me." I looked at her. She looked terrified. I didn't record that. I said nothing. She took one step backward. "Ethan!" Her expression changed. The fear disappeared from her face. A small smile appeared. "You really should have stayed inside." I raised my weapon. She didn't move. Then the world around us flickered like a television losing signal. For half a second I saw the farmhouse again. Then the field. Then the farmhouse. Then the field. Each time it changed faster. Claire's face changed too. Older, younger, different. Then it stopped. We were standing inside the farmhouse. I looked down at my hands. I was wearing my old FBI uniform. Claire was gone. Someone was knocking upstairs. 3 slow knocks. I looked toward the ceiling. Then a voice called down the staircase. "Ethan," it was my voice. "Are you ready to try again?" I didn't answer. I didn't move. I simply stood there listening to the footsteps coming down the stairs. One step, then another, then another. And when the person finally appeared at the bottom of the staircase, I realized why I had never been able to remember the first investigation. I had never been the agent investigating the farmhouse. I had been the person they were looking for, and the man standing in front of me was the first Ethan Cole. He looked at me and smiled. "You finally made it back."